Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are in the world and what time you're watching this live stream, whether live or recorded. We are doing an interesting presentation today. We're going to be joined by Robert Spencer, who needs no introduction for his great work in raising awareness about the persecuted church. His magazine, Jihad Watch, or his website, Jihad Watch, which monitors and records and keeps a spotlight on the various acts of jihad that are going on around the world. And he's written another great book. I recommend you buy all his books, but he's written another great book talking about the history of jihad from Muhammad to the present. So we're going to have him on to talk about that history. And so without further ado, I'm going to bring on Robert. Peace be with you, Robert. How are you?
Very good, thank you. How are you?
Good to see you. Well, thank you. It's always good to have you back. I do like having repeat guests. I remember we had a good conversation last time. And today you're going to beguile us with a telling of a forgotten history, I believe. Is that correct?
That's the idea, absolutely.
Fantastic. So as we always do, we're going to start with an opening psalm as our prayer. You're going to read it all the way through, and that'll be our opening psalm. So over to you, and then we'll get started.
All right. This is Psalm 16. Preserve me, O God, for in thee I take refuge. I say to the Lord, thou art my Lord. I have no good apart from thee. As for the saints in the land, they are the noble, in whom is all my delight. Those who choose another God multiply their sorrows. Their libations of blood I will not pour out, or take their names upon my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. Thou holdest my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Yea, I have a goodly heritage. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I keep the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad and my soul rejoices. My body also dwells secure. For thou dost not give me up to Sheol, or let thy godly ones see the pit. Thou dost show me the path of life. In thy presence there is fullness of joy. In thy right hand are pleasures forevermore.
And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, yes, let's talk about this topic, the history of jihad from Muhammad to the present. Do you want to put any slides up, or are we just going to?
I'm a 20th century speaker, Bob.
I am of the same school of thought as you, Robert. I don't believe in slides on principle. It's like, get out your pen and paper and make notes.
Exactly. If I often find that a slide is going to be distracting the audience. You're talking and you've got this thing to read up above or on the screen, and it's so what should I pay attention to? Anyway, I have this book, The History of Jihad, that you mentioned, and it is designed to fill a gap. It seems to me that when Christians are dealing with Muslims, that generally the discussion focuses on the Quran, on Muhammad, and then on the present day and jihad terror groups and so on. And that's it. And so there's a huge gap of about 1400 years. What happened then? And what use could it be to those who are trying to deal with Muslims today? You've got in a big question. Now, I think this is changing, Bob. You would actually know this better than I because you're out there at Speaker's Corner. But I know that for years, we have had Islamic apologists claiming that properly understood, the Quran teaches peace, brotherhood, love, tolerance, and it's only the terrible Islamophobes who claim that it has doctrines of war. Now, I know this is changing now, that you have Muhammad Hijab openly saying we're going to fight and subjugate the Jews and the Christians. And you have Ali Dawa saying we're going to go door to door and kill the apostates. And we are proud of that. And all these people being much more open about what the Quran and Islam are actually all about than they have been in the past. Yeah. Nonetheless, I still think it's relevant to bring in the testimony of Islamic history. Islamic history actually settles the question. If anybody out there still believes that Islam is a religion of peace that has been hijacked by a tiny minority of extremists in the last century or so, all they need to do is look into what's happened in Islamic history and see, is the peaceful understanding of the Quran, if it really exists at all, is that what has been dominant among Muslims up to now, or have they understood it as enjoining violence? And I think it's very important for Christian apologists, for anybody really who is speaking to Muslims, to have a general awareness of Islamic history, because it actually settles a lot of the questions that are still outstanding. That, for example, also, you have controversies over slavery, over child marriage, over female genital mutilation, things like that. So you can look into Islamic history here again and see, well, did these things crop up as the work of some marginal sect that somehow was able to convince a significant number of people that they were correct, but the vast majority always rejected it? Was there an abolitionist movement in Islam? Was there a movement to reform the idea of violent jihad and make jihad only about the spiritual struggle? Islamic history is as illuminating for what it does not contain as for what it does. So, a general overview. You start with the purported death of Muhammad in the year 632. And then you have the period that is considered to be the Islamic Golden Age, or at least the first Islamic Golden Age, the period of the Khalifa Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphs from 632 to 661. And that's the caliphates of Ali, Umar, Uthman, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. And Umar, Uthman, and Ali were all assassinated. Ali, the last of these, who reigned in the 650s up to 661 when he was finally murdered, he was facing an all-out civil war instigated by Aisha, the mother of the believers, so-called, among the Sunnis, and the famous child bride of Muhammad. By this time, she was a little bit older, and she instigated a full-scale rebellion by getting Muawiyah, a Muslim general, to rebel against Ali's caliphate. So, in brief, you have the Golden Age, the period of the rightly guided caliphs, the idea that of the ideal Islamic state, which this period is often held up as among Muslims, characterized by the assassinations of 3 of its 4 leaders and a full-scale civil war at the end of it. That civil war, of course, was the seeds for the lasting split between the Sunnis and the Shia. That split was formalized at the Battle of Karbala in Iraq in 680, when Yazid, the son of Muawiyah, fought against Hussein, the son of Ali, and murdered Hussein, and ended the idea of a factional dispute for the leadership of the Muslim community between the Shi'at Ali, that is the party of Ali that thought that Muhammad had chosen Ali as his successor and he was the rightful successor along with his sons after him, ended that entirely and created 2 groups within Islam which persist to this day. And those are, of course, the Sunnis and the Shia. The Sunnis are 85% of Muslims worldwide. The Shia obviously are a much smaller group, although they do control the Islamic Republic of Iran and have a majority in Iraq. But the Shiites believed that the successor of Muhammad had to be a member of his household, and thus a relative first of Ali and then somebody in his lineage. So most of those people, who were 12 in number, were also murdered by the Sunnis. Now, all these murders matter because these people were killing the other people because they believed that they were the rightful successors of Muhammad, or in the rightful group of the true Muslims, and that the other people were therefore heretics and essentially apostates, and that consequently they were legitimately to be killed under the rubrics of Islamic law. And so you don't really have a community of peace right from the beginning. Now, Christianity, people might object and say, well, you know, there were all sorts of wars between the Catholics and the Protestants in Europe, but also there was peace. There was an actual peace agreement that was made, I believe the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, and that ended the open violent hostilities between the two groups. The split, of course, persists to this day, and there are also the Orthodox Christians. There was never violence between the Orthodox Christians and the others, but there is prevailing a sense that while we have our disagreements, we will settle them peacefully or live with one another and tolerate the presence of one another. Sunnis and Shia have never felt this way. And there are sporadic incidents of violence right up to this day. Quite recently at Jihad Watch, I reported upon a rare instance of jihad violence in Oman, which is kind of an outlier in the Islamic world in that it's a generally peaceful country. But in Oman, there was a recent Islamic State attack where the Sunnis destroyed a Shiite mosque. Now, it's interesting also to note that Oman is the home of Ibadi Islam, which is a sect that is not very well known and is limited pretty much to Oman itself. But they are the descendants, the theological and spiritual descendants of the Khawarij, the Kharijites, who actually rejected the rule of Ali and Muawiyah at the time of the first fitna, that civil war I mentioned earlier in the late 650s. And they went to war with both groups and said that you cannot lead the Islamic community if you're a sinner, which basically means that they were at perpetual war with anybody who led the Islamic community, since, as we know as Christians, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So that was also another violent group in Islamic history that recurs, although Al-Qaeda and the ISIS group and all the others that we see today are not descendants in any direct form of the Kharijites. They are often labeled as Kharijites by the various Muslim majority governments around the world because they're at war with other Muslims. But they're at war with other Muslims because they consider them to be heretics and apostates. And that is a practice that goes all the way back to the beginning of Islamic history. And that you deal with such people in a violent manner is something that is hallowed by the behavior of Muhammad's closest followers right after his death. So this is one problem that we see throughout Islamic history. We also see, and this is related to that, revivalist movements. That is, movements that are going to get back to the basics. Reform movements, like the Protestant Reformation in Christianity. Martin Luther said he was going to strip away all the later additions and get back to what he presented as the true basic form of Christianity. Now, a lot of people know about the Wahhabi Muslims, and they're the same kind of thing. They're Lutheran Muslims, because they said they were going to, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who lived in the 18th century, said he was going to strip away all of the later additions in Islam and get back to the basics. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that there have been movements of that kind all the way through Islamic history. The Almohad movement, the Almoravids, the Mahdi movement in Sudan in the 19th century, many, many others. They were doing the same thing or claiming to do the same thing. They were going to strip away the later additions and bring Islam back to its essential nature as stipulated by Muhammad himself. Now, that's fine in principle, except here again, this was something that was done with violence. Every one of these movements waged violent jihad, because that is taught by the Quran and Muhammad, against the other groups that it considered to be apostate. And so the Wahhabis who were Arabs in Arabia fought against Ottoman rule on the basis that the Ottomans were not good enough Muslims and that they were therefore to be killed. And these other movements throughout Islamic history also did the same thing. But the mainstream Islamic movements were pretty much just as violent. After the defeat of Hussein at the Battle of Karbala in 680 and the formalization of the split between the Sunnis and the Shia, actually before this, Muawiyah, the Sunni leader, had already made his caliphate into a hereditary thing. According to Islamic theology and law, the caliph should be a member of the Quraysh tribe. This is according to the Sunnis, and thus a kind of a kinsman of Muhammad, not necessarily part of his household as the Shia hold, but it had to be a Quraysh, but otherwise you choose the best man who's available in theory. Really, it's the most cutthroat who prevails over his enemies, because we're talking about groups that have sanctified violence and think that violence is something that Allah uses and blesses. So the Caliph Muawiyah in the 660s made it into a hereditary thing. His family was going to be the best men now. And so Yazid was his son. He defeats Hussein. Then you have the caliphate going on, and those are all the relatives of Muawiyah. That's known as the Umayyad Caliphate. In 750, the Umayyads were overthrown by another group, the Abbasids. And the Abbasids then became the primary caliphate in the Islamic world, although a little while later, at the beginning of the 10th century, in 909, a Sunni Umayyad Caliphate was established in Spain. That is, Umayyads who never really got over the Abbasids defeating them in 750. And so they went over to Spain, which the Abbasids had very scant control over because they were situated way over in Baghdad and they didn't have the military reach to keep hold of Spain. So some Umayyads gathered and established a caliphate there. A little while later, also in the 10th century, you have a group of Shia establishing the Shiite Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt and other areas of North Africa. Now, all this is accompanied by blood. All of this is done in a violent manner. And it's all justified, that is, the violence is all justified on the basis of the Quran and the example of Muhammad in dealing with his own enemies. You may recall that toward the end of Muhammad's life, around the time of the Battle of Tabuk, the Battle of Tabuk being his first and only great expedition against Christians, where a great deal of Surah 9, which calls for warfare against Jews and Christians and is very clear about the necessity to undertake violent jihad, much of Surah 9 was revealed, according to Islamic tradition, in the context of the Battle of Tabuk. Less well noted is the fact that on his way there, he encountered a mosque that was operating not under his auspices. It was a renegade mosque, a Protestant mosque. So on the way back, he stopped by there and destroyed the place. And so this is the example of the man who's the excellent example, the perfect model of conduct. This means this is how Muslims should deal with people who are rivals in different sects. And this has always been the case. Then, of course, you have the example of Islamic history in regard to non-Muslims. And so we have the fact that the great Islamic conquests that conquered most of North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, and part of India by 100 years after the traditional date for the death of Muhammad, all of those were, of course, matters of extreme violence and the forcible subjugation of the non-Muslim population and the imposition of dhimmitude, all the laws that mandate the subjugation and just institutionalized discrimination of the non-Muslims. Now, a lot of people don't realize this, even to this day. I remember reading a book, a social studies book for high school, that spoke about how, beginning in the 7th century, Islam supplanted Christianity in Egypt and the rest of North Africa, as if people began to convert to Islam because of its sheer wonderfulness. People began to convert to Islam because they were reading the Quran and convinced by it. This is actually something you never see in Islamic history. This is one of those things I mentioned at the beginning, one of the absences. There is no mass conversion that is peaceful in all of Islamic history. There are plenty of mass conversions, but they all come within the context of violent subjugation, conquest, and the subsequent dhimmitude. The Egyptian Christians didn't all leave the country, and they didn't all get convinced to convert to Islam by its truth claims. The Egyptian Christians all converted to Islam, with the exception of the hardy 10% or so Coptic Christians that are still there. The Egyptian Christians converted to Islam because life was made so miserable for them as Christians that ultimately many of them opted to get out from under all this discrimination and daily humiliation by converting to Islam. We can be sorry that they did that, but unless we were in this position, we can't really say that we wouldn't do that either. We can
Robert, just pause for a second.
Yeah. Yeah, you're frozen. Have
Hello,
you lost
Robert? Are you
Hello?
Yeah, I'm having some Wi-Fi problems. So let me let me just turn off some devices, and hopefully I'll be able to improve the Wi-Fi. So just bear with me a second and maybe rewind to the last 30 seconds of commentary, and we'll pick up again from there in a second. Bear with us. Right, I've turned off my other electrical devices that use the Wi-Fi, so hopefully that'll improve the reception because there's not as many competing devices. So I apologize about that. So if you just rewind to the last 30 seconds, because that's where we got kind of interrupted, and just try again.
The idea of the dhimma is to make life so miserable for the non-Muslims that they will see conversion to Islam as the superior option, not because of Islam's superiority, but simply to escape the misery that has been brought upon them by the Islamic rulers. And so this is something that you have to bear in mind in seeing the Islamization of the whole area. But it's also important to note that when Islam conquers an area, it immediately asserts its superiority. And a lot of people don't realize this either. You remember a few years back, there was the controversy in the United States, you may remember, of the Ground Zero Mosque, that there was an effort to build a 16-story mosque, a very major structure, at ground zero, right in a building, on the site of a building that had been extensively damaged in the September 11th attacks. And so I was pointing out at the time that this was going to be a triumphal mosque. It was presented as a mosque of reconciliation and peace. But I said, there's never been a mosque of reconciliation and peace anywhere in the Islamic world. But there are plenty of triumphal mosques, because what the Muslims do when they conquer a land is immediately assert the supremacy and victory of Islam and the superiority of Islam over the religion of the land. So in India, you have thousands, literally thousands, of mosques built on the site of Hindu temples that were destroyed. And often the Hindu idols were broken into pieces and strewn at the entryway of the mosques, so that the Muslims would be trampling upon the Hindu gods as they walked into the mosque. You have also many, many churches around the world that were converted to mosques after the areas were conquered. The Church of St. John the Baptist, which is now the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, is one very major example. And of course, the foremost example is Hagia Sophia, which was the grandest church in the Christian world for almost 1,000 years, and became a mosque when Constantinople was conquered in 1453, was turned into a museum by the Turks in 1935, but then again into a mosque in 2020 by Erdogan, as he wants to reassert the glories of Islam. You have the Temple Mount, which is the site of the Jewish temple, but is now the site of not one but two mosques, the Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock. Now, these it's not accidental that Islam claims as holy places the exact sites that are holy places of the non-Muslims, because the idea is to show that the non-Muslims' God has been defeated and destroyed, and that Islam is superior. This is why there are cries of Allahu Akbar, Allah is greater, with jihad attacks, because Allah is greater than your God is what is being asserted by the attack itself. Anyway, in Islamic history, the Abbasids, which is where I left off in the brisk historical survey here this morning, or this evening, or whatever it is, the Abbasids did not escape this violence and ultimately were supplanted by the Ottomans, or the Turks, that is to say, first the Seljuk Turks and then the Ottomans. But the Ottomans established a new caliphate while the Abbasid Caliphate still existed. And so here again, you don't have unity, you don't have respect for authority and peace. You just have, once again, the violent replacement of one group by another. And the Ottomans, of course, were the masters of a great empire at their height. And at one point on September 10th, 1683, were besieging Vienna. On September 11th, 1683, I should say. And then early in the morning on the 12th, were defeated by a group of Christian warriors, notably from Poland under the leadership of Jan Sobieski, as well as Hungary and elsewhere. But that was the high water mark of the Islamic expansion into Eastern Europe. The Ottomans held on to a great deal of Eastern Europe for a considerable period thereafter, but went into decline. And it's noteworthy that that decline corresponds to the period of the impoverishment of the Jews and the Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Now, this is very important, because you know from the Quran in chapter 9, verse 29, that the Quran mandates that the Christians who are subjugated pay the jizya, the tax, to the Muslims. And the Caliph Umar says in a very famous, notorious tradition in the Hadith that the Muslims must always make sure to collect the jizya, because it is the source of the livelihood for them and their descendants. And this is very important, because going back to the beginning, to Muhammad and the Hijrah to Medina, he didn't take the Muslims from Mecca to Medina and set them up with farms or with stores. He started to raid the caravans of the Quraysh and the other Arabs. And so that is the paradigm. When you have in the Ottoman Empire very wealthy Jewish and Christian communities, and they're all paying this tax, then the Ottoman Empire was fearsome and powerful. When the Jewish and Christian communities were bled dry, as was inevitable because of the laws of dimitude that mandate that they only have the most menial jobs in society, many had influential positions in the Ottoman Empire, but that was always a departure from Islam that was always resisted by some of the Muslims. Consequently, the communities ultimately did indeed go into decline and were impoverished. And then their taxes are not so large, then because they simply don't have the money anymore. And then the Ottoman state goes into decline because they don't have a work ethic. They don't have an idea that they will go out and create things and sell them and earn on that basis. Their only idea of how to make money is to bleed dry the Jews and Christians. Once they were bled dry, the Ottoman Empire became what was called the sick man of Europe. And ultimately it fell. And this was at the end of World War I, where it backed the losing side in World War I and was dissolved not long thereafter. And 100 years ago, in the 1920s, many people thought jihad is a thing of the past. You look at the Islamic world and you have the Turks, Kemal Ataturk in post-Ottoman Turkey, and Reza Shah in Persia, both saying what our trouble is Islam. Ataturk was much more forthright about this than Reza Shah, but Reza Shah followed Ataturk's example. But Ataturk said Islam was the theology of an immoral Bedouin and a dead thing. And he said the reason why the Ottoman Empire fell was because of Islam. So he was going to establish a secular state on the Western model. And many people thought, oh, now there's no more jihad. That's all over. It's a historical relic. And the problem is that they didn't understand that jihad is deeply embedded in Islamic theology. And so it was inevitable that it would recur, that it would return. And with the Saudis striking oil and jihad groups able to gain access to that amount of money, it did return. And ultimately, it was pressure on the secularism of the Islamic Republic, of Iran, rather, that created the Islamic Republic of Iran, that led to the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So ultimately, you have a very bloody history that you can read about in much greater detail in this book, The History of Jihad. And you have the persistence of jihad throughout this Islamic history, along with slavery and dimitude and the sex slavery of infidel women and all these things that people think are extremist nowadays. They're actually constants throughout Islamic history. And that in itself shows that what Christian apologists and what others have been saying about Islam all these years is absolutely accurate. And that the people on the other side who've been claiming that Islam is really peaceful and doesn't teach any of these things, their claims are exposed as lies by the record of Islamic history, unless you're going to tell us now that for 1400 years, the vast majority of Muslims have been misunderstanding Islam. And I'm ready for that to come out next. So that's where, that's the presentation, Bob. And so we can take the discussion from there.
Okay, brilliant. And thank you very much. And I think it's important that we try to remember just how important history is as a thing, because history frames your present, doesn't it? You understand your present because of your past. You know, like that. We do that individually. We do that as nations. Like in America, you frame your existence based upon the War of Independence, where you stole our colonies, but we'll let you off for that because we're on the same side today. But, you know, like we frame things based in history, and my joke is just an example of the same. And so it's fundamentally important that we try to understand that it's fundamentally important to the question of radical Islamism in Europe today as to whether it's rooted in history, because if it is rooted in history, then we can rightly assume that we're never going to get rid of Islamic radicalism in Europe. If it's not, and say your thesis is wrong, which by the way I don't believe it is, but let's pretend it was, then perhaps the analysis that these are just extremists, they're ignorants who don't know under their own religion, that could be true. And so your argument, your thesis of your book is actually a defeater to the liberal analysis of the cause, root, and expression of what we call radical Islam, that it is an anomaly, that it's people who are ignorant, that they don't understand their religion. If your thesis is correct, that analysis is wrong, and we need to rethink the whole equation.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Well, even just the term radical Islam is based on the assumption that this is something that is a departure from ordinary Islam, and that ordinary Islam does not have these features. I think that's one of the main things that this book shows, that actually this is ordinary Islam, and that you could speak about radical Islam in the sense that these are the people who are getting up off their couches and actually fighting versus those who just can't be bothered. But if you're talking about radical Islam in the sense of meaning that this is some new thing, some new kind of Islam that the world has not seen before, there's no basis for that. But I have seen analyses of that kind. People claiming that modern day jihadism dates from the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, or the establishment of the Wahhabis in the 1700s. But both of them and many other claims of that kind don't recognize that this has been going on throughout Islamic history. And they also don't recognize that you never have a period in Islamic history of 1400 years of peace and no jihad between Muslims and non-Muslims. You never have a reform movement. You never have, you have reform movements, but they, like I was saying before, they just want to make it worse. They want to go back to the basics, and they end up being more violent. You don't have a movement like we have nowadays, where you have Muslims saying, oh no, Islam is really peaceful, and we're moderate Muslims. We don't believe in any of that warfare and violence. People are still fooled by these people and still think that they're the real Muslims, the true thing, when actually they're the anomaly that has no historical foundation. They're the
where would you? I mean, so for instance, like, I think this is one of the things that the West just doesn't understand, or at least the progressive leadership of the West doesn't understand. Because obviously what you're talking about is the Islamic narrative. You're talking about a meta-narrative within the texts of Islam that has played out through history, because it's sourced and exampled by Muhammad. And that means that at any point, because we know that a vast majority of Muslims don't actually tap into that story, they don't practice Islam properly. They practice it in a modified way, or in a way that's incomplete or ignorant. But at any time, a Muslim could tap into that narrative of jihad and become radicalized. Oh. And so, if you were to sit down in front of the security services, as I think maybe you did at some point in the past, in more intelligent times, but if you were sat down in front of the security services, what would you say to them in regards to how they can deal with that potential of people just tapping this radicalization theme overnight, quickly?
This is a very difficult problem, and really it goes back to larger issues, because ultimately the answer to your question is there is no way to deal with that. As long as you have people who believe that the Quran is the perfect word of Allah, then you have that potential. I think the most vivid example of that is a young man in about 20 years ago now, 18 years ago. His name was Mohammad Reza Tahiri Azar, and he was an Iranian, a student in the United States at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is where I went to school as well, but a little bit before him. And in 2006, he was a student, a college student, and he was doing all the things that most college students do nowadays, which is, drink a lot of alcohol and try to get girls in bed and all these things. And at a certain point, he had an awakening. And he realized, I'm wasting my life, which he was. And I need to make something, I need to make a change, a radical change. And so I will turn to God. Well, turning to God in the only context that he knew meant to read the Quran and to start to go to mosque. Now, he wrote a series of letters to the University of North Carolina campus newspaper, and they published them briefly. I was able to capture a few of them, but unfortunately they took it all down pretty quickly from the internet. I think they realized how dangerous it could be. But this fellow, Muhammad Reza Tahiri Azhar, had made a detailed study of the Quran, a very extensive and careful study, where he listed out all these passages and what they enjoined upon him as a believer. He was a Muslim, but he was a new Muslim, essentially. He had just awakened to the full seriousness of what it meant to be a Muslim. And so he wanted to understand that more fully. So he's going through the Quran and he's writing out everything the Quran tells him to do. Ultimately, he rented an SUV and drove it onto campus and tried to run over and kill as many students as he could. And this was the result. He himself explained in his letters of his extensive study of the Quran. So when you ask about how can intelligence officials prevent that, they can't. They can monitor mosques where you have people tied to jihad groups, and they can try to pay attention to chatter on the internet of people talking about jihad activity. And certainly there have been many foiled plots, and so we have to commend them for that, that even despite their willful ignorance regarding Islamic theology, they've still been able to keep a pretty good handle on jihad activity, with some notable exceptions. But how are you going to prevent somebody from becoming like this kid at the University of North Carolina? There's no way. As long
it sounds to me like, Robert, you're making an argument for that we should have a policy of seeking proactively, without obviously forcing people, but seeking proactively to seek the conversion of Muslims as a matter of public policy to another faith. And I would be all in favor of that. It's the only solution.
It's not possible in the United States because it would be seen as a violation of the First Amendment, that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion. In Britain, of course, you're still nominally, officially a Christian state. It ought to not be a problem. But I think culturally, of course, the same conditions prevail in both countries to the extent that it would never happen. But yeah, if we want to not have jihad activity, then convincing people not to believe in the Quran is an excellent way to go about it. And ultimately the only one that's going to work.
Yeah, because ultimately, as you know, as more Muslims learn about their faith, and they learn about their faith past the narrow constraints of sort of liberal education and British media, they are going to discover these texts just to support what you're saying. So I'm sure this is a book that you know of. This is a book called The Reliance of the Traveller. I'm sure it's a book you're aware of. So this is a book of fiqh from the Shafi school, the Shafi legal school. So it's a madhab. And in the fiqh on jihad, in section 099, it reads, the caliph fights all other peoples until they become Muslim. Oh, because they are not a people with a book, nor honoured as such, and are not permitted to settle with paying the poll tax, the jizya. Though, according to the Hanafi school, peoples of all other religions, even idol worshippers, are permitted to live under the protection of the Islamic State if they either become Muslim or agree to pay the poll tax, the sole exceptions to which are apostates from Islam and idol worshippers who are Arabs, neither of whom has any choice but to become Muslim. And also in this same section in 093, it says, jihad is also personally obligatory for everyone able to perform it, male or female, old or young, when the enemy has surrounded the Muslims on every side, having entered our territory. Okay, so this is about a war of defense. So it's talking about, but this is in brackets. But yeah, it's talking about a obligation of defensive war, where it goes. It's a long description. 091, it says jihad is a communal obligation. When enough people perform it to successfully accomplish it, it is no longer obligatory upon others. So it's quite clear that that jihad is an obligation. It's an obligation to defend the Muslim community, but it's also an obligation to fight against those who aren't Muslim until they become Muslim. And that's from that's from the Reliance of the Traveller. That's that book there in section 09. Reliance of the Traveller, a book of Islamic fiqh. And so, you know, your point is absolutely sound. And I think that really and truly, and I've become convinced of this the more I've thought about this and looked into it, is that liberal secularism isn't the answer. And that actually what we need are Christian countries, Christian states working towards a Christian politique. And without that, I don't see where a liberal society pulls an answer from.
Well, this has been a big conundrum, yes, because you have, for example, the First Amendment that I just mentioned saying Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion or prohibiting the exercise thereof. And so a few years back, there was the prosecution of a couple of doctors in Michigan who were performing female genital mutilation. And female genital mutilation was against the law in that area, and they were being prosecuted accordingly. And the judge threw out the case out, saying this was part of their religion, and consequently they could not be prohibited from doing it. And I thought this is the most dangerous ruling that nobody's noticed in any American court in over 200 years, because you have this guy saying that they have to be allowed to practice their religion with no restrictions, and that consequently you have female genital mutilation. Well, this judge doesn't know it, but he's also just said you can't resist jihad. And if somebody blows something up, you can't do anything about it because it would be it would be infringing upon their free exercise of religion. But this is a conundrum that the American legal system has not faced and shows no willingness to face. Instead, they continue in the fictions about Islam being a religion of peace. But ultimately, all the societies of the West are going to have to face the question of whether they can tolerate a radically intolerant ideology, whether their pluralistic society can admit a radically monochromatic and non-pluralistic, even anti-pluralistic entity that will ultimately destroy it and subsume it all under its purview. And nobody wants to face that, but it's going to happen. It's coming a lot more quickly in the UK than it is here.
Yes, absolutely. We're seeing Islamic radicalism much more emboldened on our streets. We have the police now almost on a regular basis cowering before mobs. They're always brave when they come heavy-handed against individuals, but they seem quite timid these days in the face of mobs, and it is a worrying problem. One fact that I write, and I know you've said it already, but I'm going to underscore it, is that in the last 1400 years, there hasn't been a single year in 1400 where some Islamic army hasn't marched somewhere against some Christian population crying out Allahu Akbar to wage violent jihad. And I don't think people recognize that. I don't think Christians recognize that. And there seems to be a lot of ignorance in the church as well. And I was wondering how you think, as Christians, we can tackle that ignorance amongst the body of Christ on these kinds of questions.
That's a tough one,
It's
Bob.
okay to say you don't know. I've got ideas.
I have plenty of ideas. The problem is that the church doesn't want to deal with this. And so, for example, now it's 11 years ago, I was invited to speak at a Catholic conference about Muslim persecution of Christians. And the whole thing was advertised, and then there began to be protests because it was Islamophobic and so on. All this, all the usual nonsense. And the Roman Catholic bishop of the area, Robert McManus of Worcester, Massachusetts, if I recall correctly, he issued a statement saying I would not be allowed to speak, and I was being disinvited from the conference because he said that talk about extreme, violent Muslims, he wanted to emphasize these were not mainstream or ordinary Muslims, but and their persecution of Christians would harm the wonderful progress that the Muslims and Christians had been making in dialogue. And
that's
so
literally chucking the persecuted church under the bus.
Yeah, but think about this, that he's saying our dialogue with the Muslims is so wonderful that we're not going to talk about the persecution of Christians. So what exactly is the point of the dialogue? The dialogue has not saved a single Christian from being persecuted. It hasn't saved a single church from being burned to the ground. What has it done at all? Nothing, except make guys like Robert McManus feel good.
Yeah.
And he feels so good about it that he doesn't want to talk about unpleasant things.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me that if you want the answer to your question, if we're going to figure out how to awaken the church to these issues, there has to be a fundamental reorientation of the church as a whole across denominations and religious traditions, a fundamental reorientation of the church toward Islam, and a rejection of this fantasy that we can sit down and talk it out, and that this talk will make them discard their theology of jihad and subjugation.
Yeah, I think talk when you're talking to someone who's not actually interested in changing that, the absence of reform is just pointless. It's making me feel good. It's not helping you. And obviously, when you say church there, we're talking about church leadership. And one of the obvious things that we need is just better church leadership. And I agree with you. We need a reorientation in our approach to Islam. But the first step of that reorientation towards dealing with the existential threat of Islam is that we have to have a reorientation towards the solidarity with the persecuted church.
Yes.
Because I think that a greater awareness about the persecution of Christians is the first step in getting people to rethink the liberal progressive dogmas about Islam.
Yes.
But
other obstacle there too. Excuse me. But another problem with getting the Christians of the West to identify with the persecuted Christians in the Middle East, to a lesser degree in Africa, is sectarianism, and that people are tempted in all of the groups of Christians to say, well, those other people, they're not really Christians. They're not the real thing. And so it's a shame that they're suffering, but we don't really have any solidarity with them as brethren. And that's a very dangerous idea as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, the disciples of the devil are active in the church, and we should all be aware of that. Now, we've talked about this idea of reform, so I think it would be remiss if we didn't mention the Ahmadiyya. Because Ahmadiyya Muslims, as I understand it, whilst they do believe in Sharia law, and whilst they do believe in their own version of Sharia law, and whilst they do even believe in things like capital punishment, even for apostasy, they don't believe in achieving their ends through violence. They're much more like a missionary movement within the Muslim world, and they reject violence as a means to an end. They just keep violence within the apparatus of the state, which is fair enough. I mean, everybody does that. So are they not an example, therefore, of Islam reformed? And what's your thought on that, given the thesis of your book?
It's I don't think it's Islam reformed because it's a different thing altogether. Now, the Ahmadiyya will very strenuously insist that they are Muslims. The government of Pakistan has ruled that they are not Muslims and are not allowed to call themselves Muslims, and they persecute them violently as heretics. But it's important to note that they did not reform, if they reformed at all, because they studied the Quran and came to some understanding of it that allowed them to create a theological framework that was peaceful. They reformed because they have this Messiah figure, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who taught peace. And they see the Quran through the prism of his teachings. Whereas ordinary standard Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims don't believe in Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. And so they don't accept his understanding of the Quran. It's also important to note that the Ahmadi are about 1% of Muslims worldwide. And so I understand why people are excited by them, because they seem to embody all the kinds of things we want to see in Islam, although I find them to be, to a man, every last Ahmadi Muslim I've ever had personal dealings with has been absolutely unpleasant and completely
really?
at odds with a person who you would think would be an adherent of a creed that said love for all and hatred for none, which is their slogan. Just some of the most pleasant people I've ever encountered, wildly arrogant and nasty.
You should meet the Ahmadiyya in England. They're actually quite friendly, to be honest.
And,
it's maybe it's something about America.
maybe because also in the United States, the Ahmadi movement is very much aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood and all the subversive activities that the Brotherhood is involved in the United States. So I don't know.
Maybe the Brotherhood's undermining the Ahmadiyya movement in America. I wouldn't put it past them.
Maybe so. But in any case, you're talking about an outlier, you know?
Yes, of course.
Good that they reject violence, but they cannot be in any sense represented as even close to mainstream Islam. It would be like taking, I don't know offhand, of a Christian group that's 1% of the Christians, but maybe if I said something like the fire-baptized Holiness Primitive Baptists in Georgia and North Carolina, those are the real Christians. Well, there just aren't very many of them, and their theology is not representative of the vast majority of Christians worldwide. So with all due respect to them, I don't know that I could really sustain saying that. And that's about how I feel about the Ahmadiyya as well.
No, I think it's worth just pointing out that the one group of Muslims that reject violent jihad are persecuted by other Muslims.
Yes.
And the only reason why they reject violent jihad is not because they're appealing to the Quran, but actually because they're appealing to their prophet, their latter-day prophet, as it were. And they're no more. But it's worth pointing out, because obviously we're talking, a big theme of this is, can Islam be reformed? And the answer is no. In terms of, because obviously, some liberals might stumble across this one day, and their instinct will go, well, you're saying that something is bad. You're talking about another religion as being bad, and that can't be true, because all religions are good, or all religions are equally possible to be good or bad. So I'm going to go to the mosque, and I'm going to ask the people in the mosque, and obviously that this just lays them up, doesn't it, for a Muslim apologist to come in and say, oh no, jihad is all about peace and all about defensive war. Because we read from The Reliance of a Traveller, one aspect of jihad is certainly defensive war, and we don't deny that. So maybe just talk a little bit about the violent jihad against Christians in any of your examples, whichever period that you want to, because I know it's been going on for 1400 years. Maybe the most recent, or even maybe a comparison between the actions of ISIS and the actions of the Ottoman Empire.
Well, let's take the actions of ISIS versus Muslim Spain, because Muslim Spain was established in the context of a conquest of Christians, the Umayyad Gothic, no, I'm sorry, the pre-Umayyad Gothic state was a Christian state, and then the Muslims conquered it, and it became a center of the international slave trade for the entire Islamic world. And I have accounts in the History of Jihad book of how the slave girls were instructed to behave in a coquettish manner, that is, to try to show that they would be sex slaves and be exciting in this way. And they were told this by their Muslim slave masters. Now, this sex slavery is important because you asked about a connection with ISIS. And of course, in recent years, we have seen it with Hamas on October 7th, with ISIS when it had its caliphate in Iraq and Syria about 10 years ago, and with Nigeria with Boko Haram before that. And in all cases, they kidnapped, abducted non-Muslim women and then made them into sex slaves, actually sold them in markets and so on. And this was a feature of tolerant, pluralistic Al-Andalus, the fabled Muslim Spain that's supposed to have been a golden age and paradise of tolerance. Actually, it was the same thing, that just as ISIS was able to conquer large portions of Iraq and Syria, and in its heyday was actually larger than the UK in size, so also in Spain, starting in the year 711. Actually, it's also important to note, interesting to note, that the Muslims conquered Spain in 711 because of an angry Christian. There had been a Christian whose daughter he sent to the court of the Visigothic king, and the king had his way with the daughter. And this fellow, Count Julian, was so enraged that he made an alliance with the jihadi ruler, the jihadi leader, Tariq ibn Ziyad. And Tariq ibn Ziyad then was able to use Count Julian's boats to get across the Strait of Gibraltar and get his troops into Spain. When, if he had used his own boats, you see, then the Visigoths would have said, oh, the Muslims are coming, and they would have been on war footing. But they thought these boats were this Christian guy. They were friendly. They let them come. When they got to the beach, Tariq ibn Ziyad ordered the burning of the boats. Now, that's important because he told his troops, you see, we're going to take this place for Allah or we're going to die, but there's no going back. Now, why do I mention that? Because a few years back, there was a controversy in Minnesota, in the United States, about a school that was a public school, which in the United States means it got funding from the government for the school. Schools that are public schools in the United States that get funding from the government are not supposed to teach any religion, but this was in an Islamic area of Minnesota where all the students were Muslim and it was teaching Islam during the school hours. So there was a controversy over this school getting federal money and teaching Islam. The name of the school, Tariq ibn Ziyad Academy. And nobody in any of the coverage ever said, hey, who is this Tariq ibn Ziyad? But it was named after, the school was named after the conqueror of Spain, who burned his boats, actually not his boats, but the Christian turncoats' boats, and said, we're going to stay here and conquer or die. Seems to me that's significant.
Well, it's also important just to underscore for all the liberal progressives that everything and all the Muslims who are sincere and were or all the Muslims who are noble, and we know that there are noble Muslims out there who are horrified at what ISIS did, and all the liberal progressives who are horrified at what ISIS did, but then in their ignorance are celebrating the occupation of Christian Spain and Portugal. Absolutely everything that ISIS did happened in Andalusia, Spain.
Yes.
Absolutely everything. It also happened, everything that ISIS did also happened in the Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
Everything that ISIS did also happened in the Fatimid Empire. Everything that ISIS did happened in the Abbasid Empire, in the Umayyad Empire. So, like, if you're condemning ISIS, you're condemning the actions of every Islamic empire in history.
That is correct.
And so here's a question to you. Why, in your opinion, that there is obviously an ignorance about this? Do you think it is willful ignorance on part of the elites because they can't face up to a problem? Or do you believe it's just a lack of education? Why is it that people don't know this history, especially the liberal elites?
Well, the liberal elites are at war with history precisely because of what you were talking about earlier, Bob, that our history grounds us and gives us an identity. And so in the United States, you said what was it? The quip about
you stole our colonies.
Yeah. So that is true. I grew up being proud of George Washington and the American revolutionaries. But it's important to note that nowadays, the young people grow up in America learning that those people were terrible racist slave owners and deserving of no respect. And just recently, in all the pro-Hamas demonstrations everywhere, they were smearing red paint on statues of George Washington. And there were and statues of Thomas Jefferson. A statue of Thomas Jefferson was removed from the New York City Hall. And there were statues torn down all over the country of founding fathers. Now, this represents the left's hatred of the United States and desire to destroy it. And see, they understand exactly what you were saying. They understand that if they control the history, they control the present and the future. And so if they can make us ashamed of our history, then we will not be willing to defend our country today. And we will lose it in the future. And so the left is actually trying to obscure the glories of Western civilization in general, not just of the American founders, but of all the heroes, people we used to think of as heroes. Churchill in the UK, so many others. They're trying to obscure that history or turn us against our previous heroes so that we'll be softened up and easier to defeat, so that they can impose the socialist mega state that they want to establish. That goes with the Islamic project also, of course, because if you're waging jihad against people who are proud of their identity and of who they are, then they'll fight. But if they hate their identity and think that they come from some criminal regime and that Islam is noble and wonderful, and that's also going on. A textbook jihad where I was appalled when I saw high school textbooks right from around here not long ago, the local school, and they were teaching about Islam in entirely 100% positive manner, never mentioning jihad violence and being harshly critical of Judaism and Christianity. This all has a purpose.
I think what that draws out to me is the absolute importance of Christians to start teaching the history of the church in the church from a Christian perspective.
Yeah.
And it is important for all of those who are maybe even not Christians to just start digging into the history of Western and European, American, Anglophile, Francophile history. Because if they don't know that history, how can they begin to argue? But the moment they engage that history, they're going to see that you're telling the truth.
Yeah. And that's another problem, that we're here talking today about how important history is. But if I were to go out on the street here and ask the first 10 people I see about any of the historical details that we've discussed on this show, or even just basics about American history or European history, they would most likely not know. And Americans don't know history. They don't care about history. They don't realize its significance. And
it's the liberal malaise.
Yes.
Because it's one of the malaises of the West. It's one of the malaises of liberalism. But obviously, at this point, everyone's going to throw up the question of the Crusades. But you Christians, you had the Crusades. What about the Crusades? So what are your thoughts on the Crusades? I love the book, and I do want it at some point, which is The Politically Incorrect History of Islam and the Crusades, I think it is, or is that what his name was? Or...
Yeah, Politically Incorrect
Yeah.
Guide to Islam and the Crusades. That is a book I wrote in 2005. This book, which is from 2018, The History of Jihad, it deals with the Crusades in more detail because it's a history. In the Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, I give an overview of the First Crusade in the context of the problems of jihad that the world faces today. But if you really want to know about the Crusades all through, then there's this book. Also, if you'll pardon me, I'll be right back.
You've got another book for us, because I would say that the reason why I say the reason why I want to know your opinion on the Crusades, Robert, is because obviously the Crusades are presented in lots of left-wing education as being some aggressive act on the part of Christians against innocent Muslims, where we invaded Muslim land, we occupied Muslim land, and we killed lots of Muslims, and we did it just explosively out of religious fanaticism, and it came out of nowhere. And that's the historical presentation of the Crusades. But what's your thoughts?
This other book. This is a book called Empire of God: How the Byzantines Saved Civilization. This is a book I wrote last year. I hope you will pardon all the advertisement, but the fact is that book also deals in depth with the Crusades, because the Crusades happened not because of Christian racism or imperialism or any of those things that you were just outlining, but actually because the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, actually more precisely, they never called themselves Byzantines, but what we call the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, and they called themselves just Roman Empire, they were suffering terrible defeats, and they were being victimized by the Islamic jihadis. The Romans had been defeated by the Seljuk Turks, who were Islamic jihadis, at Manzikert, which is in what we call now Eastern Turkey, in 1071. This was the heartland of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And it was Christian territory. It was territory that was ruled by an emperor who considered himself to be a servant of God, who considered himself to have a responsibility, a Christian responsibility toward his people. And the church was the most important institution in the empire. But in any case, they suffered this terrible, crushing defeat, destroyed the whole army in the year 1071 at Manzikert. This is one of the most important battles of Christian history that no Christian knows about. And the Turks, Islamic jihadis, won this battle, such that all of Asia Minor, which was, as I said, the heartland of this empire, this Christian empire, was open for the jihadis to conquer. And they did. And nowadays it's Islamic land, it's Turkey. And the emperor, Alexios Komnenos, appealed to the Pope, even though the Eastern churches and Western churches had just split, and there were not great relations between Western Europe and the Roman Empire. Still, he had nowhere else to turn. He appealed to the Pope on Christian grounds and said that we're going to lose all this territory, the heartland of the Christian world at that time, to the jihadis, and we need your help. And it was on that basis that the First Crusade came together. In 1095, the Pope to whom the Emperor Alexios appealed, Pope Urban II, called the First Crusade. The crusade was not meant to, as some imperialist project, and it was not because innocent Muslims were studying their book of peace and minding their own business, and suddenly all these Christian warriors descended out of Europe. It was because thousands, literally thousands of churches had been destroyed, and a tremendous expanse of Christian territory had been conquered, and Christians who were trying to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land, to visit the places where Jesus lived, they were being kidnapped and sold into slavery or killed outright. And so the Christian emperor asked the Pope for help. and the Crusades were a defensive action as a result. Now, this is obscured to some degree by the fact that the Crusaders did do some things that were undeniably wrong. They burned down Jerusalem after they conquered it in 1099, including a synagogue where a whole crowd of Jews had taken refuge, and laid waste to the city in a way that nobody is interested in excusing. But this kind of thing, unfortunately, was common in warfare of all groups at the time. This is not to excuse it, but just to say that to act as if the Christians were uniquely violent is ahistorical. And to pretend that the Crusades were some gratuitous offensive act is ahistorical. And so I strongly encourage you. You know, it used to be up until recently, Bob, excuse me, but this is one last important point on this. It used to be not too long ago that people knew this in general, and people were proud of the Crusaders for trying to defend Christian civilization, such that you had sports teams in schools all over the United States. I don't know if this is true in Britain. I don't even know if you guys have names for sports teams, because I hear about Manchester United. I don't know. Does it have a nickname? You know, like the Eagles? Or
no,
the Bears?
no. Well, I'm not a footballer, so I wouldn't know. But
well, I don't know either. But in any case, in America, all the sports teams have names like that, and a lot of them were called Crusaders. But over the last 20 or 30 years, they were all renamed because we're ashamed of the Crusades now. And that's a shame, because it just shows that historical ignorance is growing.
And I totally agree, because up until quite recently, you would find reference to Crusaders in a positive sense. Yes. You know, the Methodists launched a crusade against the devil's drink, against alcohol abuse. Billy Graham crusades, you know, Campus Crusade. That, you know, so it's a language that as Christians, and also there's a festival that's connected in the Christian calendar, the Catholic calendar at least, that celebrates the Battle of Lepanto. I think it is on the day of, and you know, I think it's called.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so it's part of our history. It's part of our culture. And you mentioned the Siege of Vienna, and the Holy Leagues were the successor to the Crusader movement. And the Holy Leagues, which were brought together initially by the Pope, but then by just Christian secular leaders who formed alliances to defend Christendom, were the very forces that stopped Islamic Jihad at the gates of Vienna.
Yes.
Because if I recall, it was Holy League. It was an army of the Holy League that stopped the Ottomans at Vienna.
It's important also to note that the jihad against Europe began in the 7th century and continued without any let-up, year after year, century after century. And it was only stopped for the 200 years that the Crusaders were in the Holy Land. The Crusaders arrived and conquered Jerusalem in 1099, and the last Crusader territory was conquered by the Muslims again in 1291. So that's almost 200 years, and there were no jihadi incursions into Europe during that period. So we can say with near certainty that if there had been no Crusades, then Europe would have been conquered and Islamized. But that 200 years gave the Europeans a chance to regroup and to gather strength such that when the jihad onslaught did recur, they were able to repel it at Vienna in 1683.
Amen. And I think it would be remiss for us not to talk about the consequences of the acts of jihad, which is Arabization. You know, we get taught a lot about the evils of Western colonialism, and I don't want to play down the fact that Western colonialism has its evils, for sure. I'm not a defender of Western colonialism. But everyone is silent about the fact that Islamic Jihad led to Arabization. The whole of the Middle East was not Arab until Islamic Jihad led to Arabization. The whole of North Africa was not Arab until Jihad led to Arabization. And there are religious groups and ethnic groups that are completely overlooked when we talk about the Arab world. There's no such thing as an Arab world. There is occupied Assyrian land, there's occupied Coptic land, there's occupied Berber land, there's occupied Kurdish land, there's occupied Jewish land, there's occupied Greek Christian land, there's occupied Armenian land. The list goes on. And I just wonder if you want to comment on that. And
yeah, this is very important also, because you mentioned Western colonialism, Bob, and here again, I understand. I'm not interested in defending it or saying that the colonials were sinless in every respect or anything of that kind. But if you look, for example, at the Middle East, there were Western colonies. You have the French in Lebanon, the French in Syria, the English mandate for Palestine before the establishment of the State of Israel. You have the English in Egypt, various others, the French in Algeria and Morocco. And in all of those places, while they were friendly to the church and certainly didn't prevent churches from being established, they never made any effort to stop people from being Muslim or to go against Islam at all. Quite the contrary. As a matter of fact, of course, the English made common cause with the Arab Muslims against the Ottomans, and then rewarded them by giving when the Saudis defeated the Hashemites in Arabia, then they gave 78% of the mandate for Palestine that was supposed to be for a Jewish national home to create Jordan. Anyway, there are many other examples of that kind of thing, but the point is that when the Muslims conquered even some of the same territories, long before the British and the French came, they completely Islamized as well as Arabized those territories, such that and as I discussed before, the Christians were so oppressed, so subjugated, that ultimately they converted to Islam simply to have a better life. But the majority Christian presence in North Africa, in Egypt, in Syria, and elsewhere was completely erased, destroyed to the degree that there's no trace of it. Whereas the Western colonials did nothing of the kind when they took the same territories.
And where are the descendants of the slaves of the Islamic slave markets? That's
Indeed.
the next question. Because as abhorrent and as evil as the Western slave trade was, you can find the descendants of Western slave trading. But where are all the descendants of the African slaves that were taken into Islamic slave markets? Where are all the descendants of the European slaves that were taken into Islamic slave markets? You've got the annihilation, not just of entire cultures and the oppression of other ethnic groups and the colonization and Islamization of former Christian land. But you've also got the fact that millions of souls, tens of millions of souls, were poured into the Islamic world as slaves and raped, and their descendants, can no longer be spotted. You can't see them.
Mm-hmm. And people don't know this. They don't know there were Islamic slave raids in England, in Ireland, in Iceland, all over Europe, all around the coastal areas. There would be ships coming in, and a number of people would be seized and taken away and never seen again. And you want a harrowing account of this? There's a book by Giles Milton called White Gold, which is actually built around the account of, I believe, a 16th or 17th century Englishman who was taken into Morocco as a slave, kidnapped out of England, taken to Morocco, was a slave for years, was able to get free, and ultimately write a book about his experiences in Morocco, which were quite harrowing. And of course, he was the exception. Most of these people were simply murdered when they were no longer useful. And you don't see their descendants because many of them were castrated, many of them were killed. They were not able to have families or something like that. You have the women who were sex slaves, who in many cases bore children. And that is the reason why you have, for example, people like there was an Iraqi general in Saddam Hussein's regime who had red hair. I don't remember his name, but I would see him and I would think, oh, you're the descendant of a sex slave.
Yeah. And I would just say to anyone who watches this from the Middle East, if you look like a European, you probably are the descendant of kidnapped Christians, kidnapped Europeans. Reclaim your heritage. You're the descendant of stolen children. You're the descendant of stolen women. Reclaim that heritage and throw off this Arabization and this Islamization that was imposed upon your ancestors. Now, we've mentioned Turkey a couple of times. We've mentioned the Ottomans a couple of times. And obviously, Ataturk established on the back of a genocide against Greeks, Assyrians, and Armenians, the modern secular Turkish state. And Erdogan is an Islamist who has managed to recapture, the secular state for Islam, which I think insists that secularism isn't the answer to Islamization, but Christendom is. Do you want to comment a little bit on Turkey, Erdogan's ambitions, Erdogan's actions? I don't know if you're familiar, or you keep up with local politics. Is that something you follow?
Very much so. Yeah, Erdogan is wanting to, as you noted, destroy the secular state. He's already done that to a tremendous degree. He wants a restored caliphate, a restored Ottoman Empire that would reclaim all of the lands that the Ottoman Empire once occupied. And so he's been very explicit about this. And recently there was a map shown on Turkish television of what Turkey would be like in 2050. And it was huge because it had, in this fantasy, had conquered all of the surrounding territories because they were once part of the Ottoman Empire. The most threatened country immediately is Greece, because it's right there, and Turkey is increasingly aggressive against the Greek Navy and the Greek Air Force in the Aegean, claims many of the islands that are part of Greece, and ultimately claims the whole of Greece, because it has to be remembered that Greece was part of the Ottoman Empire, was the first territory to break away. In 1821, the Greek War for Independence began. In those days, we had a much healthier sense of who we were in the West, and so the Greek independence struggle against the Ottomans captured the imagination of the entire Western world. The great English poet Lord Byron went and fought with the Greeks against the Ottomans. Many other people from the West did as well. I believe Byron was killed there, if I'm not mistaken, but in any case, he fought. And nowadays, of course, nobody even remembers any of this. But in Islamic theology, any land that belongs to Islam at any point belongs by right to Islam forever. And so everyone believes that Greece is actually Turkish land, and so is Albania. So are all the former republics of Yugoslavia, as well as Bulgaria and Romania, as well as Israel, Syria, Arabia, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, Bahrain.
They might surrender the claims to the Muslim bits, but they'll probably want the one, because Muslims still claim Andalusia back, don't they?
Oh, I think something else, Bob. I've got to mention. I'm sorry, but I apologize for cutting you off again. But you got it when we're talking about Erdogan and imperialism. Got to mention Azerbaijan and Armenia. Azerbaijan is a Muslim state, of course, very close to Turkey. And if you take a map and you look at Central Asia, you've got Turkic and Muslim states all the way across, broken by the Caspian Sea, but otherwise you've got Turkey and then Azerbaijan, and then across the Caspian you've got Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkic Muslims. And the only non-Muslim state in all that band, that whole expanse of territory, is Armenia. And so recently we had the Jihad against Nagorno-Karabakh, which was an enclave of Armenia inside Azerbaijan. Historically Armenian, Christian since the 4th century AD, the 3rd century AD, ethnic cleanse just last fall. the Armenians expelled, nobody cares, the churches destroyed, and the traces.
130,000. I just want to. There was 100. I think it was 130 or 150,000 Christians last year. Man, woman, child, old, young, able, disabled, from town, from village, from city, from settlement, from farm, was driven out completely.
Yes.
And the world has been absolutely silent about it.
And now you have churches that date to the 3rd century, the 4th century, and the crosses removed. All the traces of the Armenian presence are being erased. This is exactly what happened that we were discussing in North Africa, in Egypt, in the Middle East. This is how the Islamic world was formed. It's happening right now in Armenia and around Armenia. No sooner did Nagorno-Karabakh be ethnically cleansed that Erdogan made a claim that part of Armenia that remains is Turkish land. And the idea is to destroy Armenia completely and have this Turkic Muslim entity all the way across Central Asia.
Yeah, and I think we really should be making, as Christians, a lot more noise about this, and we should be demanding that our governments support militarily Armenia and Russian Orthodox Christians. I call upon all of them to call out Putin for his failure to defend the Armenian Christians. And really, Russian Christians often like to think of Russia as the defender of orthodoxy. And yet Putin has basically got in bed with the jihadis in Azerbaijan.
That's right.
And in Turkey. And he's betraying Christians. And so we shouldn't look at Putin as some kind of defender of Christians. And we should call him out and ask him, well, who is his God? Is it himself? Is it his money? Is it his women? Is it his nation? Is it the state? Or is it Jesus Christ? Which is it? Because right now he ain't looking much like a defender of anything Christian.
He's friendly with Turkey. I think he's friendly with Iran, though. And Iran is at odds with Azerbaijan because they want to claim Azerbaijan. And so it's all very tangled up. But ultimately, your question is very important, very well taken, that Putin is not at all somebody that is consistently a defender of Christianity and should be called out about that.
Yeah, and we should also point out that Turkey still occupies northern Cyprus.
That's right.
and has done since the 1970s, which was another example, a 1970s example, another example of Islamic Jihad leading to the religious and ethnic cleansing of a Christian population and the annihilation of the heritage of that Christian population. So we're not just talking about ancient history, we're talking about recent history. ISIS, Azerbaijan, Turkey. The desecration of Hagia Sophia can't go unmentioned as well. And I really think it's time that everybody starts saying that NATO kicks Turkey out, because Turkey's no friend of NATO. It's using NATO. And the moment NATO needs Turkey, and it's in Turkey's best interest to drop NATO, it will do. And if our leaders can't see that, they're fools.
Yeah. But of course, our leaders can't see that. And NATO is not going to kick out Turkey because the West in general refuses to conceptualize the problem in the way that Erdogan does. They refuse to have the awareness necessary to take him seriously enough to try to picture the world as he pictures it. The importance of this is that the West doesn't pay any attention to religion. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all of Hamas and all the other groups always talk about it in terms of Islam. And yet every peace process, every attempt to negotiate a settlement in the West never mentions Islam and never considers it. And it's the same thing with Turkey, that for Erdogan, it's all about Islam, but the Europeans and the Americans refuse to think about the world in terms of Islam or not Islam. The Europeans, very famously, the European Union rejected a definition of Europe as including the word Christian. They won't define themselves as Christian, but Erdogan defines himself as Islamic as opposed to Christian Europe. So we have a
Yes.
strange situation where only one side is fighting the jihad, and
Yeah.
yet it's still going to be fought.
And incidentally, that's why I voted Brexit and campaigned so hard for Brexit, for the point you just mentioned about the refusal to acknowledge the Christian identity. It's the liberal blind spot. The liberal blind spot assumes, because of the Enlightenment, that religion is a private and personal matter of low heat, low intensity. And so for that reason, as a private and personal matter, it can't factor into our thinking about social policy or public policy. And that's the blind spot that keeps biting the liberal progressives in the ass.
Yes.
And he's still doing so.
For Islam, religion is political, public, universal, and supreme. And so they're being very foolish and short-sighted to continue to think of it as a private matter only.
And I just want to say, we're organized. There's a Christian street protest movement here in the UK called the Disciples of Christ. I'm going to punt my own thing now, Robert. But on the 24th of August, we are having a protest outside the Turkish embassy, and we're inviting all the victims of Turkey's aggression, the Armenian Christians, the Assyrian Christians, the Greek Christians, the Cypriot Christians, and Turkish Christians, and anyone else who has suffered at the hands of the Turkish state and the Turkish government, to come and join us at that protest outside the Turkish embassy at 12 o'clock on the 24th of August.
That sounds great. I wish I could be there, but as you know,
we're also encouraging for Christians to form their own chapters of this protest movement. It's just one job: protest on Christian issues on the street. So they're going to organize a protest outside the French embassy because of what the French government did, what the French did recently with the Olympic ceremony. But that's a side issue. So let's come back to the topic. In terms of dimitude, we've spoke of that. Could you maybe highlight, if the Islamic revivalists win, and they manage to get their Sharia state, and they manage to subjugate us all again to dimitude? Obviously, I'm for the chop, you're for the chop, so we're not going to have to. But in terms of dimitude, what awaits the dhimmis in an Islamic state? What are the conditions and life expectancy, and what kind of things could you expect to happen to you if you were made a dhimmi in an Islamic Sharia state?
This is also a very important question, Bob, because a lot of people think. I just recently actually saw a video, David Wood and Inspiring Philosophy were talking about, and I came on for a few minutes to talk about this video of this guy who was praising, praising Islamic civilization and saying that the Jews and Christians lived in peace. All they had to do was pay this little tax. And that's not at all the case. The reality was that the dhimma was extremely precarious. It was a difficult existence where the Muslims could decide that they were in violation of the terms of the protection contract at any time and kill the Christians or the other groups. The idea is that you are not to question, not to criticize Allah, Muhammad, or the Quran. If you're perceived as doing so, then you can be the contract of protection, which is what the dhimma is, can be revoked and you can be killed. Now, it might seem like, okay, then just don't criticize Islam. Sure, except there were instances you could just have somebody walking up to you and say, do you believe Muhammad is a prophet? No. And then you're charged with blasphemy. This happens to this day in Pakistan, and so to the Christians in Pakistan. So if you have an Islamic state established in Europe and the contract of dhimmitude imposed upon the non-Muslims, then you're going to have an institutionalized discrimination as well. Not only do you have to watch what you say and be extremely careful, and your protection can be revoked and you can be killed by a mob at any time or imprisoned or whatever. Not only that, but also you have to accept second-class status. In Pakistan that I just mentioned, the Christians are called sweepers. It's the colloquial name for Christians. Why are they called sweepers? Because that's what they usually are, street sweepers. They have the most menial jobs in society because they're not allowed to have any other jobs. The Dhimma stipulates that the non-Muslims must not hold authority over the Muslims. So that means they can't be any kind of employer. They can't be the boss. They are always at the lowest strata. And they
or have deep political representation. I think we might have
no political representation.
We seem to be having an internet problem.
Hello.
Right. So the last thing that I'll tell you what are you still there? Hello, yes. Hello. Right. So I'll tell you the last thing I heard, and you can pick up your thread of thought. So the last thing you said was they can't be employers because they're not allowed to have authority over the Muslim.
Yes. So they only have the most menial jobs in society. So in Pakistan, they're called the sweepers. If you have the institution, we can all hope it won't happen, but it very well could in Sweden or Britain or Germany or France in the next few years. If you have an Islamic state, you're going to have many people losing their jobs. You're going to have the imposition of the requirement of having Muslims at the helm of pretty much every concern, every business. This won't happen overnight, and people will be denying that it will happen right up to the end, but it certainly will. And you have
even in the UK today, I know personally of stories where at the immigration office, the border control office, a Muslim border control officer was trying to deny a Arab Christian of and said to his face, this is how brazen and blatant it was. He said, "You're an Arab, you're a Christian, you're evangelizing Muslims. I'm not going to give you the 2-year visa. I'm only going to give you a 1-year visa." And this Christian, bless him, he fought it all the way. He got the guy sacked. But I don't know how he managed to communicate it to him, whether it was on the day when he first made his complaint. The Muslim said to him, "Don't worry, I'm not the only one." And that's very ominous.
Yeah,
that is very ominous. and we're seeing institutions being penetrated by Islamists in the UK, and the government seems unable to recognize or to deal with that. And they're getting into the police force, they're getting into the civil service. Obviously, I'm not trying to say that all Muslims are Islamists. I'm not trying to say that, so don't mishear me. But there is penetration of Islamists into the institutions of the state. We had NHS doctors go off and fight for ISIS.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Even Jihad Watch.
More of that.
Yeah, you say it. You know what I'm going to say.
Well, the Dimitude will.
Let me finish. Sorry, Robert. I'll jump in with. There was recently an Islamist guy who I think he was found guilty, or he was recognized as supporting terrorism. He's been cleared to work inside the NHS.
Yeah, see, they're afraid of being called Islamophobic to the degree that they're absolutely paralyzed in the face of these people. This was a man who is working with ISIS, is it?
I can't remember if it was Anjem Chowdhury. I think it was connected to Anjem Chowdhury.
In any case, he's clearly somebody who wants Sharia in Britain. He's in favor of jihad, and he's not going to be kept from acting as a physician, even though it's very clear. I mean, I wouldn't want to go to him as a doctor. Many other people wouldn't. Jewish people certainly would be in grave danger. And yet the British state cannot act against these people because of what you were talking about before, that they are committed to the idea that religion is a private matter, as well as to the idea that Islam is peaceful. And those are dogmas they're going to take to the grave of their own nation.
Absolutely. It is deeply concerning. And I think that maybe in the last few minutes, I just want to try and focus in on responses. And if you like, there's obviously a lot of Christians that are watching this. And there's obviously a lot of other concerned people that are watching this. And there may be the odd curious liberal progressive that stumbles across this and has, the wit and gumption about them to sit and listen. what would you, particularly to Christians and those that are already acknowledging that there's a concern, in terms of our responses, what kind of things do you want to encourage Christians and others to be doing?
Well, in the first place, you have to pray and see this as a spiritual battle, because that's what it is. This is the quintessential spiritual battle, I believe, because you've got the idea of people calling good evil and evil good, as the prophet Isaiah said there would be. You've got the time coming, as the Lord said, when men will kill you and think they're offering service to God. And these are the Muslims. We have to remember there's a hadith, there's a tradition in which Muhammad says that on the day of judgment, there will be no one more odious in the sight of Allah than the one who says he is the King of Kings. So what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with people, a force that makes people think that when they are evil, they are pleasing God. And that's the worst kind of thing you can do to a human soul. So that's the first problem. That's the first thing we have to do. But second, also to try to communicate to our fellow Christians insofar as we're able. And here, of course, we're going to get a lot of pushback from Christians who are misinformed but think that they know, and think that the Muslims will fight with us against secularism, or that they're our brothers in the faith and so on. And that's exactly what we need to try to combat in every way possible. But that involves being deeply aware of Islamic theology, history, and law.
And I think ultimately, if I was to try and give a singular narrative that would allow us to galvanize all of our energies politically, socially, culturally, economically in the right direction to correct both liberal, progressive secularism and degeneracy, but also the threat existentially that's posed by Islamists, Islamic revivalists, is that we need to be pushing for a new Christendom. And that's what we need. We need to. We've got American Christians have just got to admit that the American Constitution was badly written, and you need a better state. The British need to admit that the monarchy is not a defender of the faith, and we need to. The French have got to admit that the French Republic has failed, and we need all of us to push to a new Christendom.
Well, Bob, I do agree in the sense that we need a general recovery of the Christian faith in the West. I don't want to go on record saying I want a new constitution or anything like that, but
I'll say it.
That's fine. You can say it over there, but the Constitution certainly was written for a majority Christian people, and
it assumes.
I don't think that it works so well with people who have no identity or or understanding of morality.
I think one of the authors
the vacuum Islam will fill.
Yeah, I think one of the authors of the Constitution said as much. He said, our Constitution was written. He either said for a moral people or a Christian people. And it is a constitution that couldn't survive without such a people.
Yeah,
and I might be misquoting him. He'll probably turn up in the comment section. But he was right. His analysis of the Constitution is right. The American Constitution is failing because it was built with the assumption that the general population was Christian.
Yes,
and without that general population being Christian, the American Constitution is faltering.
Yeah, certainly, there's a deep constitutional crisis today. We could do another show about that, but without a faith of their own, people are generally just vulnerable to dawah, and they're looking for some meaning and identity for their lives, and so it's an open field for Islam in the West today.
I totally agree. So on that appeal for a new Christendom, I'm going to draw this to a close. And I just want to say thank you so much, Robert, for your time. It's a pleasure every time I have you on. You're always so informative. I don't mind you punting your books, because the thing is, people need to get educated. People need to get educated, and you're an educator because you're telling the narratives that the liberal progressives don't want us to hear because
well,
of
Bob. I
their.
appreciate that. And I appreciate your indulgence on that regard. I figure if the people are watching this are interested in these topics, well, they can learn a lot more in these books. So
Absolutely. So I'm going to close us in a psalm, and then that will be the end of the live stream. So I'm reading from Psalm 17. Lord, hear a just cause. Pay attention to my cry. Listen to my prayer. From lips free of deceit, let my vindication come from you, for you see what is right. You have tested my heart. You have examined me at night. You have tried me and found nothing evil. I have determined that my mouth will not sin concerning what people do. By the words from your lips, I have avoided the ways of violence. My steps are on your paths. My feet have not slipped. I call to you, God, because you will answer me. Listen closely to me. Hear what I say. Display the wonders of your faithful love, Saviour of all who seek refuge from those who rebel against the right hand. Protect me as the pupil of your eye. Hide me in the shadow of your wings from the wicked who treat me violently, my deadly enemies who surround me. They are uncaring. Their mouths speak arrogantly. They advance against me. Now they surround me. They are determined to throw me to the ground. They are like a lion, eager to tear, like a young lion lurking in ambush. Rise up, Yahweh. Confront him. Bring him down with your sword. Save me from the wicked with your hand. Yahweh, save me from men of the world, whose portion is in this life. You fill their bellies with what you have in store. Their sons are satisfied, and they leave their surplus to their children. But I will see your face in righteousness. When I awake, I will be satisfied with your presence. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Goodbye, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the live stream.